Hey, how's everyone doing? This is Melvin here, and I've never done this before. I have always been talking about, eating your own dog food, and today I'm gonna attempt to do the same. I'm gonna attempt to do what I have been preaching for the longest time, and essentially what I'm gonna do is I am going to be teaching everything I know, and I had a long thought about this whole process itself. I mean, I'm like, really, should I be doing this? And what if I do this and it kind of totally bomb in my face? How's it gonna be? And I was just nervous about it, to be honest, right? But that said, I have decided to take the plunge. I've decided to do this, and what I'm gonna do is essentially here's what I'm going to do. I've never done this before, right? So just bear with me. Now, what I'm going to do is the following. I'm going to teach what I have been teaching for the past 10 odd years. These are the exact slides and materials that I've been using to teach schools here in Singapore. And I'm about to share the whole thing with every one of you here. Now, part of the reason why I want to do this is because I want to make sure that the whole idea of, you know, teaching everything you know is something that I don't not just talked about, but it's something that I actually do. And so here I am, I am going to take this to the next level, and I am definitely going to be talking about it. So, this is going to be one hell of a long video itself. So if you have got time and if you want to know what exactly I'm doing, make sure you stick around. If not, we're all good. That's great. No hard feelings there. But really, I mean, if you really want to find out like what I've been doing, what I have been up to for the last many years, then definitely, join me here in this episode itself. Right. So, without further ado, here's what I am going to do. I am going to start streaming this, and I'm going to start teaching this whole, um, thing itself. So, um yeah, if you have got questions for me, and some of you might be watching this and wondering like, how's this going to benefit me, right? And I'm going to tell you up front, um here's how it's going to benefit you, right? I'm going to be talking about, essentially, I'm going to be talking about strategic planning, right? And how you, as a small business, and how you, of course, in the case here, what I'm going to be, the examples I'm going to use are largely going to be about schools, but essentially, you can still use this for, your small business itself. So, if this is something that you have been wondering, this is something that you want to learn more of when it comes to strategic planning for your small business, then definitely uh, you want to stick around for this one, right? The comments are open, but what I'm going to do is I am going to go through each segment, and at the end of each segment itself, there's going to be a couple of segments. So at the end of each segment itself, what I will then do is I will then open up for Q&A. So if you got a question, make sure you leave it in the in the comments below, and once I am done with that segment itself, I will open it up. All right, and so with that, what we're going to do is now we're going to transit into slide mode. Okay, let's do this. All right. And so we're good. We're into slide mode now, and let's get to it. So, like I said, if you got a question pertaining to strategic planning and how this can benefit your organization, make sure you leave your questions in the comments, and I will get to it when it comes to the end of each segment. So there are several segments here. So if you want to, follow along, make sure you grab some water. And here we go. Hi. So this first segment, I'm going to talk to you about strategic planning. Now, essentially, the easiest way to think about strategic planning is that this is where you are and this is where you want to be. And in order for you to figure out how you're going to get there, you are going to need to take a series of steps to reach your destination itself. So the process of strategic planning, it's the process that is going to help you chart your way towards your end goal. All right. And so when it comes to strategic planning, I like to think of it as there is a process. And when we talk about process itself, there are certain steps that you would have to take. So the first step when it comes to strategic planning is what we call environmental scanning. Now, environmental scanning essentially allows you to take a look at a few things. One is that it gets you to look at your internal scan. So what does internal scan looks like? Well, essentially it looks like you reviewing your internal results, you reviewing your internal performance, you reviewing your internal capabilities, your resources internally. So essentially it's looking inward and asking yourself, where are we at in terms of our performance? Where are we at in terms of our people? Right, and where are we at in terms of our capability, our capacity, as well as where are we at in terms of our resources. So that is the internal part. Now, then the next part is essentially the external part. Now, the external part essentially looks at a few things. One is that it looks at the state of the industry at that point in time. So, for example, up until 2019, we have very much been seeing education as a particular way of you know, it was how it was. But right now, when you look at the external landscape, the educational landscape itself, it has moved tremendously. So this is where you definitely want to, critically ask yourself, what are some assumptions that we have once held about education, which now it's no longer relevant? What are some assumptions that we had about, learning online? And now that it's no longer relevant, or now it's even more relevant, for example, right? So there is the external scan. The other aspect of external scan would also require you to look at, for example, the competition. So you may have a good year, you may have a several good years in the past, but what you really want to look at is how are you doing vis-a-vis your competitors, right? And when you look at your competitors, what essentially it gives you is that it gives you perspective. And so this whole aspect of environmental scan essentially is looking at your internal as well as the external. Now, once you've collected all this data and information, what you need to do then is to conduct a SWOT analysis. Now, what exactly is a SWOT analysis? A SWOT analysis essentially requires you to look at what are your strengths and your weaknesses. And this will be from the perspective of internally, right? So look at your strength and your weaknesses. And then externally, you're looking at what are some of the opportunities that are available and what are some threats that presents itself. Now, one of the most common mistake that I see many people make is that they kind of think that environmental scan equals to SWOT analysis. Now, that couldn't be further from the truth. The way to think about this is that an environmental scan is essentially a process that you go through to collect data about how you're doing internally and how you're doing externally. What's the environment like externally? That is the process of the environmental scan. Now, the tool, right? There are many tools, but one of the most common tools that most people use when it comes to conducting an analysis of that data, it's called the SWOT analysis. So the SWOT analysis essentially is the tool, and the process is the internal and the external scan. Now, once you've done the environmental scan, you then move on to the next phase is you want to review or you want to formulate your vision, mission, and values, right? And so essentially we are going on the assumption that you already have a VMV for short, right? Vision, mission, values. We're already assuming that you have a vision, mission, and values already. And so what you want to do right now, essentially, it's not to go into that re-envisioning exercise, but what you are doing is to review and ask yourself, it's my vision still valid? Is my mission still valid? And what about the values? Are the values still valid in order to help us arrive at our end goal? Right? So this is where you review. Now, when you review, you have to base it on data. You have to base it on evidence. So it's evidence based. It's not based on how I feel and how you feel. Right. So the vision, mission, and values essentially you want to review it, essentially looking at the data and the information that you have. Now, of course, once you have a review and you say that, well, my vision is going to stay, my mission, I may change, whatever the case may be. Once you've done that, of course, the next part is then you decide on the strategic thrust. Now, many a times people ask me, what exactly is a strategic thrust? Now, the easiest way to think about a strategic thrust is the following. Let's say you have a rocket, and this rocket wants you want to use this rocket to reach the moon, right? And this rocket, does it have a three engine or four engine? Is it a three engine or a four engine rocket? So if it's a three engine rocket, then it has got three thrusts. If it's a four engine rocket, then it is a four thrust engine, right? So when you think about how am I going to reach my vision, mission, and values, you want to ask yourself, what are the various engines that I have? What are the various focus that I have? So typically in a school environment, you would have, one thrust will be focusing on learning, another thrust is going to be focusing on character, the third thrust is going to be focusing on staff, and then the final thrust is going to be looking at perhaps partnership, for example, right? And then, so once you have all these different trusts, you can then think of what are the goals that you want to have for each trust itself, right? And so once you have defined your goals, the next logical step is to ask yourself, how would I know when I've arrived at the goal, right? How would I know when I've arrived at the goal? And the easiest way to think about that is that you need a set of measures. Now, measures, what we call them KPIs, right? And KPI stands for key performance indicators. And so these are the ways that you are going to measure how and when you have arrived at the goal. So it kind of gives you an idea. It's like a scorecard that tells you whether you've arrived or not at your goal. Now, for each of these KPIs, you would also need what we call targets. Now, targets essentially it's saying that, well, one of my KPI, one of my measure for students who are self-directed learners, for example, it's how well do they perform given a self-directed task, right? So percentage of students who and are able to exceed expectation in the self-learning task. That could be a measure. Now, and then the target would be, I want to have at least 75% of my students meeting or exceeding expectation. That would be a target, right? So the measures usually are in the form of a metric, and the targets are in the form of a number. Now, then of course you have things like key milestones, right? For example, because sometimes a particular goal doesn't really have a KPI, for example. So what you might want to do is you might want to have key milestones. So for example, at the end of the first milestone itself, what we want to see is we want to have all our teachers trained, right? All teachers trained in, let's say, differentiated instruction. And then at the second milestone is that where everybody is able to design or formulate some kind of a lesson plan pertaining to differentiated instruction, for example. And at the third milestone is where we want to see, everyone being confident in presenting their lesson packages at national level. So those are the key milestones that you could be looking at. Now, the next part really is once you have the goal, you know how you're going to measure. The next question is, how am I going to get there? And to get there, essentially, you're looking at the strategies. Now, strategies are something that you formulate, but a lot of time people ask the question of how do you exactly formulate strategies? And the easiest way to think about that is that you need a framework. Now, what exactly is a framework? In short, a framework essentially tells you this is the way I think about how things work. So, as an example, when you think about strategies for working or helping your students become self directed learners, what is your thinking about how to develop the child so that the child is able to have the skill set and the mindset of a self-directed learner? So for example, you may think that, okay, first thing first, people need to be aware that there is such a thing called self-directed learning. Next is that they must be equipped with the skill sets. And third, they must be given the opportunity. So there you have it, a framework and approach that you can use to kind of think about what are the strategies that you would have. So in this case here, the first level where you are creating awareness is just showing students or showing parents that this is how students can actually learn on their own. And then the second part is really teaching the students a set of skills, and that will become the strategies in the second phase. And then the third phase is giving them opportunities to demonstrate self-directed learning itself, right? So that would be how you're going to get there. And of course, once you have all the strategies, all that done, what you have is a strategic plan. Now, the strategic plan in and of itself, it's not going to be very valuable until and unless you convert that into what we call an action plan or a resource plan, and that is communicated, and it kind of essentially communicates what exactly are we going to do in each quarter or each term, right? And so this essentially is where the rubber meets the road, where oftentimes where things break down, the weakest link is essentially in cascading. And so this is where you need to be able to translate all the strategies at the school level down to the departmental level, and then to essentially think about how you're going to implement that. And of course, at the end of every year, you will want to do some kind of a review, right? And as you're doing this review, essentially, you want to ask yourself a few things. One is, have I met my targets, right? Have I met my targets? Have I achieved my goal? Now, the second thing you want to ask yourself is, what are some, is there a particular trend? Do I see a certain kind of pattern, right, in terms of the result itself? The third one is really you want to ask yourself, what are some contributory factors? What are some contributory factors that led to this improvement or led to us being able to achieve our goals? And then, of course, the last question is, what else can we do, right? What improvements can we make to our existing systems and processes? So, ladies and gents, here you have it. This is the strategic planning process, the 6 steps that kind of help you define how strategic planning is going to be like. All right. And so, in the next segment, we're going to go into the aspect of staff resource planning. Essentially, now that you've got a strategic plan, how are you going to translate that into a resource plan that is going to be able to help your people move and develop themselves so that they have the knowledge, the skills, and the mindset to be able to execute on this strategy so that as an organization, you would be able to achieve the goal. All right, and so that is the first segment here, where I am talking about strategic planning. And so the key idea here really is that you want to have a strategic plan, and the reason why you want to have a strategic plan is because you want to be able to know where you are, where you want to go, and how you're going to get there, right? So essentially, that's strategic planning is all about. So thank you, Mimi, for dropping by. Thank you so much for dropping by. Appreciate that. Hope you've learned. If you've got a question for me, make sure you leave it in the comment below. All right. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna move on to the next part, and the next part is going to be looking at the characteristic of staff resource planning. All right. So let's pull up the slides here. I'm kind of liking this whole setup here. What do you think of the setup, right? Leave me a comment. Talk to me, guys. Talk to me. Let me know what you think. Let me know what are your thoughts. Let me know if you're learning anything new, learning anything nice. Let me know. Let me know. Let me know. All right. Okay. So I'm going to go into the next segment here. So if you're interested, I mean, if staff resource planning is something that you have been looking at and something that you are interested in, so stick around. All right. So this is the next part here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do this. You, you see, what I'm going to do is I am going to essentially cut this into bite-sized videos. Um, and so in order for me to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this as a marker. And so every time when I'm doing the editing later on, every time I see this, I know that it's the beginning of the segment or that's the end of the segment itself. All right. Welcome to the second segment. And in this second segment, we're going to be talking about the characteristic of a staff resource plan before we kind of get into the details of staff resource planning itself. So, there are a few key things that you need to understand and need to take note about staff resource planning with some key characteristics I'd like to share with you. Number one is that you like to think of your staff resource plan as a conduit, right? It's a conduit between the strategic plan as well as your staff system. Now, what I mean by that is the following. First and foremost, of course, you always start off with your school strategic plan. This is where you have your school goals and the school objectives, your school's direction and your school focus. So once you have that in the in view itself, the next thing you want to do is you want to ask yourself this question. What kind of staff must we have in order to arrive at our goal, right? What kind of staff must we have before we can arrive at our goal? And this is where you kind of formulate your staff resource plan. You look at, what kind of staff you must have. And essentially, when we're looking at what kind of staff we must have, there are just two big rocks, right? One part is really talking about the competency of our staff. The other aspect is that we also want to make sure that our staff are engaged as well. And so once you have this staff resource plan, you kind of know what kind of stuff you want and how you're going to get them to get there. The next part is really you want to look at what are some of the staff systems that you must have in order to maintain as well as help you execute and implement on your staff strategies, right? And this is where you really look at a few things. One, of course, you look at learning and development, right? Because in order to help your staff gain or attain the level of competencies itself, what you really want to do is you want to help them improve themselves, and so learning and development is one aspect of it. The other aspect, it's really, when you talk about engagement, you want to take care of their well-being. You want to make sure that they are motivated enough to show up at work. So that essentially goes into your staff system, right? So one way of looking at it is that the staff system is going to come from your school excellence model in your staff category itself, right? So that is the first characteristic of your staff resource plan. The second characteristic of your staff resource plan is that it's got a two-pronged focus, right? It's got a two-pronged focus. What do I mean by this? Now, if you think about it, you know, what kind of staff do you want, right? In your school, what kind of staff do you want, right? And on one hand, you will want the kind of staff that you want are the ones who are, effective classroom teachers, and they are the one who is able to help your students achieve their goals and in turn help the entire school achieve their goals, right? So that it's one aspect of it. Now, if all you focus on is just that, then indirectly we are saying to our teachers that, I just want you to be really great teachers, but I really don't care about you as a person. And that is not true, right? You and I know that is not true. And so that's where the well-being and motivation bit comes in. So we want them to be great teachers in the first place. At the same time, we also want to take care of them in terms of their well-being. So we want to look after their health and wellness. We also want to make sure that they are motivated enough to not just show up at work, but motivated enough to be able to put in the best to help the students achieve their goals. And so when we look at learning and development, I like to see it as like a pyramid, right? And so at the first instance, what you have is what we call learning needs and career development. Now, learning needs, it's where you want to evaluate the learning needs of everybody. It's a bottom-up approach, right? You want to ensure that everyone's learning needs are being identified, right? At the same time, you also want to embrace that idea that everyone has the right to aspire to become something. And so, career development becomes open to every single one, right? Every single one has got an opportunity to talk about their career. Now, of course, not everybody is going to be able to be ready at the point in time, or perhaps they are ready, but we may not have the positions available for them. And so, as you go on the pyramid itself, you go into talent management, right? And here is where not everybody get the opportunity, like I said, because perhaps they are not ready or the organization is not ready. And so you have a smaller group of people that you kind of develop them, and of course you want to develop more than what the organization needs, right? And particularly in a school environment which is very unique, whereby you are developing the talent, but you may not be developing the talent just for your school. You are essentially developing the talent for the entire fraternity itself, right? And so once you have identified the suitable candidates after they've gone through the cluster interview and all that, you may put them up for succession planning. That means you kind of earmark these people for potential leadership positions, and then when the opportunity arises and when they are ready, they are given leadership appointments. So this is the learning and development aspect of it, that it's not just looking at learning, not just developing them to be effective classroom teacher, but you're also looking at them in terms of their career development. Now, the other aspect, which is well-being, that I would want to talk to you about, is that when you talk about well-being and motivation, essentially what we also want to look at is we want to create the right kind of culture in our organization. And so one way to think about the right kind of culture, it's where does it start from? It's essentially starts from the values of your organization. What are the values of your organization itself, right? So that will be the starting point. Now, values are something that it's implicit in, it's internal. So, for example, when you just look at me, you look at my photo, you look at, just me, prima facie, right? Just on the outside itself, you wouldn't be able to tell, what exactly are my values until you kind of learn to know me better. You kind of know what I do. You kind of know where I stand in terms of certain aspect, and from there, you get to find out what might be my values. So, always like to say that values is internal, and it's manifested in the form of behaviors. And so, when you look at behaviors itself, currently where you're at, right, the collective behaviors of all your staff may not be at the desired level, right? So if it's not at the desired level, which means there is a gap. And how are you going to bridge that gap? Now, there are three key things that you want to look at in terms of bridging the gap of your organizational culture. I will talk about this in a bit, right? So the three things essentially are this, right? Number one, it's you need to have a series of programs, right? A series of programs to kind of encourage your people to behave in the way that it's in sync and in line with the organization values. So think about Singapore and in the 70s and in the 80s itself. One key thing that we really want our people to take away or to be able to manifest is that we want our people to be courteous. We want our people not to speed on the streets. We want our people to be able to speak Mandarin, for example. And so what we had was we had a series of campaigns. In case you didn't know, in the past, they call Singapore land of campaigns, because every other month or so we have a campaign, and we've got a campaign for just about everything, right? We even have a productivity campaign. Can you believe that? Right. So programs, these are programs. Essentially, what they do is that they encourage the kind of desired behaviors that we want to see. Now, once it comes to a level of encouragement, it's done. And when they take away the program, does it mean that suddenly um, people are just not courteous anymore. People are just, not nice. Obviously, that's not the case, right? And so this is where, you say that it becomes common practice, right? It's not just because of the program that have been encouraging. Now it's become common practice, right? And when we talk about common practice, essentially what we want to do is we want to be able to support. Okay, we want to be able to support the manifestation and these practices that we now see. So think about, let's say right now your school it's looking at implementing something that it's absolutely innovative, right? And at the start, of course, you cannot take everyone to task and say that you must do this, right? Initially, you probably start off with a lot of encouragement, and so you have some form of program. But once you notice that it becomes more commonplace, then you can say that perhaps we should put in some structures to kind of support this practices itself. And until such time where it becomes the norm, right? This is where you are able to put in what we call policies, right? Policies whereby you will have to demonstrate that level of you know customer service, for example, for your EAS, right? You must be able to ensure that your students have developed a certain set of leadership qualities. Those becomes non-negotiable, or those becomes a KPI. That's where you put in policies to do that. So the policies usually would be at the last, with the exception of some cases, for example, like discipline, policy might come first, right? But for the most part, most aspect of it, you would always start off with programs, practices, and then policies. So just think of, when you have programs, what you want to do is you want to encourage the desired behaviors. When you have practices, what you want to do is you want to put in platforms or structures to kind of support the practices that align to the desired cultures. And finally, the policies are the ones that you want to put in place to reinforce those desired behaviors to sustain the desired culture, right? And so that is the other aspect of well-being and motivation. Now, the third characteristic of a staff resource plan is that it has what we call a system dynamics approach. Now, what is a system dynamics approach itself? Now, it's best represented with this diagram. And in this diagram itself, you would see that there is this thing called continuous improvement. And how do you go about continuous improvement? Essentially, it's you use what we call Deming's wheel. And for the most part, I think many of you would be able to identify with this PDCA cycle. And this PDCA cycle essentially leads to a whole, movement of work improvement teams, or WITs for short, right? And so this is where, it's very much of a Japanese concept called Kaizen, whereby, every day or every week or every month, you kind of make certain improvements. And with this improvements itself, what you would do is that it becomes better and better and better and better and better, right? So that is the whole approach with systems dynamics. So this is kind of the genesis of it. Now, there is one major flaw with this continuous improvement model itself, is that you know, it is on one hand incremental, which means when you see improvements, you're not going to see a breakthrough. On the other hand, is that you could go in circles, or you could keep on trying to, we say, flog a dead horse, right? You can continue to flog a dead horse, but you're not going to get the horse to move. So one way to think about it is that if we are kind of stuck with a particular way of helping our students becoming better at academic performance, we may know that there is a way to do it, and that way is perhaps drill and practice, right? With drill and practice, this is how we are able to ensure that our students is able to meet certain academic standards or certain academic benchmarks. Now, when we go with the drill and practice and it doesn't work, what do? We do more of it and we do it faster, we do it more frequently, for example, or we do it in a slightly different way, but essentially it's still in drill and practice. So what essentially you are going about is this PDCA cycle, this continuous improvement, this incremental shift that it's probably going to give you some improvement, but you're not going to see a breakthrough for the most part. And so the flaw in this model is that unless and until we kind of rethink about the assumptions that we have about learning, we rethink the assumptions that we have about development, until and unless we have that, we might not be able to break out this cycle itself, right? And so this is where Peter Senge and his colleagues at MIT, um, they kind of developed this model itself, which is called the single loop and double loop learning. So the single loop learning essentially goes something like this, right? You start off with, what's our assumption about learning? Now, once we have an assumption about learning, what we do is that we then go out there and we start implementing the strategies. Now, at the end of implementing the strategies, we then look at whether, have we achieved the results that we want? And if we don't, we kind of go back and relook at the strategies and say, all right, folks, let's come together and see what went wrong, right? And once we've identified, oh, perhaps we didn't do this, perhaps we should reschedule the thing, perhaps we should get them to come before school instead of after school because they're all tired. Perhaps we should do this, perhaps we should do that. So what you're doing is you kind of like reconfiguring the way that you do learning for your students. So that is the single loop. But until and unless we go back and say, hang on, folks, let's re examine our assumptions. Let's ask ourselves the assumptions that we had about how our students learn. Is that still valid? Right? And if we ask ourselves that question and the answer is maybe not, right? Then this is where it will give us that breakthrough, because once we are able to change our assumptions, or once our assumptions have moved, right, we are definitely going to embrace new strategies and new techniques. So, a good example is during COVID, during the circuit breaker itself, you see the amount of people who have jumped online to learn. And previously we may have certain assumptions about what it's going to become an impediment for learning, but we saw that that assumption is false, or it's been validated to be not accurate anymore. And so we kind of implement certain strategies, and that's where e-pedagogy comes into place. And of course, with that assumption, we have a new set of strategies. A new set of strategies, it might be the strategies that's going to help us achieve our goals, right? And so that is the system dynamic approach. And of course, in our case here, what I'd like you to think about is applying to staff resource planning. Essentially, is the following: you start off with your school's strategic plan. You start off with the school goals, and you ask yourself, what kind of staff must we have, right? What kind of staff must we have? Once you have an idea of the staff that you have or you want to have, the next step really is to ask yourself, how are we going to do it? What is our approach? What is the framework that kind of guide us to 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 work towards our staff goals, right? And once you have decided on that, then of course is to think about how you're going to implement that. And once you implement, of course, you have to do a series of review. And when you're reviewing, you want to review, and see whether, in terms of implementation, could you have done something better? Is there a better way to do things? And then, if it's good, what you do is you then go back and relook at your staff goals. So that essentially is, the characteristic of your staff resource plan. I hope this is helpful. The next part we will go into is the staff resource planning process itself. All right, so that will be in the next video. All right, folks. So this is the second segment itself. What we're gonna do is we're gonna take a short break, and when we come back from the break itself, we're gonna continue with the rest of the segment. So if you're watching and you're still with me, thank you so much for being here. I really, really appreciate that. And if you've got a question, what questions you have about um, about strategic planning, make sure you leave it in the comment. Thank you all these folks for joining me, you know and leaving me a like. Really, really appreciate this. All right, so thank you so much. And so, like I say, we are going to take a break now. And when we come back, we're going to continue with the rest of the segment. So, as I say, if you got a question, make sure you leave it in the comments. I will take a look at the question itself. And, if there is a question, particularly about strategic planning, let me know and I'll get to that. All right. So, I'm going to take a short break. Yeah, and thank you for being here with me. And um, let's get to this second part of the segment here, where we are going to be talking about staff resource planning itself. All right, so let's get to it. So in this part here, what we are going to be looking at is the staff resource planning process. And so if you recall, the staff resource planning process itself, it's derived from the school strategic plan. And what that means is that, when you start off with anything, you always start off with your school's strategic plan and look at the goals and the objective. So what we want to do here is the following. We want to ask ourselves, what are our goals and our school's direction? That is going to help to be the pivot for us. That's going to be our reference point. That's going to be our beacon. That is going to help us decide what kind of staff we want to have. Because once you have decided on that, the next part is really simple to ask yourself, what kind of staff must we have in order to achieve our goal? And once we're able to answer that question, that becomes our staff goals. Now, our staff goals, we can come up with the staff goals. And then, in addition to that, we will also want to look at our staff objectives. Now, the key difference between a goal and an objective is that the goal is an outcome, and the objective is essentially what you must do to arrive at the outcome, right? So let me say this again. The goal is an outcome. So an example of a goal or a staff outcome, it's like this: competent professional. That would be a staff goal. Collaborative builder, right? That is a staff goal. Um, Innovative practitioners, that will be a staff goal. Now, a staff objective essentially would be, what must we do to get there? So, if you want to have an innovative practitioner, what you must have as an objective could be to create or to design a culture that is supportive of innovative practices, right? That could be the that could be the objectives to help you arrive at the goal, which is innovative practitioner. Okay, so you always want to ask yourself, the goal itself. What is the goal? And one way to think about goals, especially in MOE context, it's always think of it as the adjective plus the noun, right? So the adjective describes what kind of person that we want, and the noun describes the kind of person that we want, right? So ethical educator, right? Competent professional, community builder. All these are outcomes. And then how are we going to get there? We are going to, create a safe learning environment, for example, to develop a competent professional. Those will be our objectives. Now, once we have the staff goals and objective, of course, the next part is really to ask ourselves, what are the KPIs and targets that we must have? So this is very similar to strategic planning when you ask yourself, what are the key performance indicators? What are the measures that you must have? The targets that must go along with that, as well as looking at it from another point of view, is perhaps you may not have KPIs, but you may have milestones, right? And then, of course, what are the strategies, what are the initiatives that you are going to have in order for you to execute on the objectives itself, right? So that is formulating the strategies. We'll take a look at some examples later on, so just hang on there, right? And then, of course, later on, what you need to do is you need to implement. And when you're implementing, the easiest way to think about that is to create a staff action plan, right? And of course, at the end of each cycle itself, you want to do an evaluation and review, as well as look at what are some of the improvements with that. So this essentially is the staff resource planning process itself. In the next segment, what we'll do is we'll go deeper into the staff goals and how you can write the goals and the objectives. I'm going to give you some examples, so stay tuned for that segment itself. All right, so in this next segment, what I'm going to be talking to you about is essentially about staff goals. So here is where we kind of break down into a granular form and look at how to write goals, right? So, a lot of time when I go into schools, I find that um, people write goals in many different shapes and form, which is fine. But the most, you know, dangerous thing is whereby we do not have clarity of the goals. In other words, if you were to go, walk in a school and randomly just gonna, you know, catch any teacher that's walking by and you're gonna ask them, this goal that you have, what does that mean? If you think that the teachers are unable to give you the same definition, or at least a definition that is very very similar, then you are in trouble. So here in this segment itself, we're going to go deep, and we're going to dive deep into how you write goals, and as well as how do you ensure that there is that level of clarity in your school, right? And so I use a framework of thinking about writing goals. And the way I think about goals is that I think of it as, what I call be and have, right? And so I always start off with, what do I want my people to be, right? What do I want my people to be? That will always be my first question. And once I have the answer to that question itself, the next one is, you know, in order for them to be this, what kind of skill sets must they have? Right? What kind of skill set must they have? And so this is where I think of it as a be have framework. So a way to think about this is that when you talk about be, right, it is an outcome. And like I mentioned in the previous segment, the outcome essentially has got two parts. So the first part is that you have what we call an adjective and a noun, right? So the adjective and the noun. And so what you have is you have, you know, a competent staff, right? The competent part is the adjective, the noun is the staff, right? So this kind of tells you that, okay, these are the kind of people that we want to have in our organization. Now, many a times I see that organization will stop at this. And this is where the problems start, as I alluded earlier, because, people are not sure what exactly it meant by competent staff. And this is where the second part will kind of brings out that clarity itself. Let's have that discussion and ask ourselves, in order for our staff to be competent, what kind of skill sets must they have? And so the answer to that question would depends on what is the focus of the school or the organization for that planning cycle itself. So take for example, in this planning cycle where for the most part most schools are going to be focusing on two key aspects. One, they're going to be focusing on differentiated instruction, and two, they're going to be focusing on e-pedagogy. And so, if that is going to be the focus, and when we talk about a competent staff, what we mean by competent staff in today's context would be someone who who is steep in terms of their knowledge and skills of e-pedagogy, as well as they have the necessary skill sets as well as the tool set to implement differentiated instruction, right? So what the competent staff must have would depend very much on the focus of the organization during that planning cycle. And it is important to have this clearly defined and clearly articulated, because what's going to happen is that you're going to find yourself 3 years down the road whereby you're going to have a different group of people in the SMC, and they're going to be saying like, when we talk about competent stuff, what exactly do we mean, right? And you're going to go through the process itself. So have that clearly defined, because that's going to give you that clarity. Now, in addition to having that clarity, you will not run into that situation whereby you will be debating with your colleagues about what are the right indicators that you should use when it comes to measuring a competent staff. You see, because if your understanding of what is a competent staff differs from mine, the set of metrics that you use would be very, very different, right? Because if your definition of what constitute a competent staff is, for example, someone who is really skilled and engaging parents, whereas my definition of a competent staff is someone who is really, really skilled in terms of you know engaging the students, then your measure and my measure is going to be very, very different. And we may both say that I'm right and you are right too, but because we're looking at it and we both have different definition, we're going to have this issue. And so one way to resolve that is to think of not just the B part but also the have part. And so the have part really is just looking at the competencies that the teachers, that the staff must have. And one way I tell my SSDs is that, when you want to kind of have a starting point, the easiest way to think about it is to go back to your EPMS, right? Because this is where it kind of gives you the definition of what are the skill sets that you want to see. So here we have in this slide here, where we say that, a competent staff is someone who has got good knowledge of and applies assessment modes to determine progress and evaluate learning. Now, where do we get it from? We got that from the EPMS, where we look at the competency and we also look at the behavioral descriptor, right? So the competency is someone who is competent in assessment and evaluation. What exactly does that look like? Well, the person must have good knowledge of and applies assessment modes to determine progress and evaluate learning. So if you're looking at this, you would definitely have an idea like, oh, what does it mean to say that our staff is competent? Let's look at another example here. Again, using the BHAF framework. And this time around, I'm going to use another example, which is very commonly used in many schools' plans. And the goal, it's called engage staff. Now, what does engage staff means? Well, once again, if you and I have got different definition, we are going to have a lot of issue trying to understand and come to the agreement that this is what we meant when we say engage staff. So once again, ask yourself, what does an engaged staff look like, right? What must he or she have? And so this could be, another way of looking at it. We're saying that, well, someone who is engaged is not just someone who is happy at work, but this person is continuously thinking about new and better ways of helping the students achieve their learning goals, and to be able to help school achieve its outcome itself. So this would, this is what a engaged staff would look like. Okay, so once again, where do we get this information from? One suggestion is go into EPMS and look at um, what are some of the behavioral indicators there, and that could be a starting point for you. Okay, so the point I want you to get away here with this segment of the video is that when you define the goal, it is fine to just say engage staff in your school strategic plan, in your staff strategic plan, but make sure you have a further documentation to explicitly say what does it mean when we say engage staff or competent staff. All right. So let me show you, how some of the schools that I consult for, how do they write their goals, right? And so, a way, the way I kind of help them think about things is that it always start off with a strategic plan. What is the goals in the strategic plan? And then think about, their staff goals, right? And then think about the KPIs and targets, and then formulate the strategies. And so, to give you an example here, um, one of the schools that I work with, they want to have, the goal is to have a restorative practice culture, right? Um, I, I, I wouldn't want to give you the exact words there because, for obvious reasons, confidentiality, and, you know, but this kind of gives you an idea of, this is the school goal. Now, in order for them to arrive at the school goal, the question that the SSD have to ask him or herself is, what kind of staff must we have, right? And the answer to that question would be the staff goal. So a world-class RP practitioner, so that is the B, right, who embodies the mindset and skill set in restorative practice. Okay, so who embodies the mindset and skill set, they must have the mindset and skill set in restorative practice. That would be the staff goal that would help them arrive at their school goal. Let's look at another one. The school wants to um, create differentiated learning experiences to meet the needs of various student segments, right? So that is their objective itself. Now, what kind of staff must they have? Well, the kind of staff that they must have would be, every staff a competent professional, right? So that's the B part. And um, and then, of course, is to say that, what must they be able to do, right? What kind of skills must they have so that they are able to do something? So, every staff a competent professional who designs differentiated learning experiences. So that would be an example of a staff goal. So here in these two examples that you see here, essentially what we're looking at is that we are saying that you can take the B and the have, and you combine that and write that as a goal, right? I mean, like I said, I need to preface this by saying that there are many, many ways to write a goal. And one way to start off is to say, what do I want my staff to be? Right? That would be the B part of the goal. And the B part of the goal essentially just have two parts: the adjective and the noun. Now you can stop it there, but what's going to happen is that you might not have that level of clarity, and you might have a huge debate in terms of what kind of KPIs to use. So one way to do that, or one way to eliminate that, is to go through that discussion and then decide what kind of skill sets must my people have, right? Once you've identified the skill set, you have two options. One option is to write it into the staff goal, like what you see here in the slide, or the other alternative is just to keep the staff outcome competent professional, but then have the part about the skill sets, the competency written in the strategic plan itself. All right. I'm just going to give you another example of another school that I work with. So this school, what they wanted to do is that they wanted to make sure that their plans are complete, right? And so when you look at the plans, they have what we call a goal, and then for that particular goal itself, they have one or two objectives to arrive at the goal, right? And so, the goal here that you see here, it's, a self-directed individual who is creative and critical thinkers, right? Self-directed individuals who are creative and critical thinkers. So that is a goal for the school, a goal for the student. And then in order to get there, they have two objectives. Objective number one, develop personal leadership qualities in students. And number two, design a learning experience to develop creative and critical thinking in students. So that's how they're going to get to their goal itself. Now, what kind of staff must they have? Well, you know, the the way that they think about this is that they say that, well, my staff must be an engaged staff, right? Someone who is effective at integrating, making thinking visible into teaching and learning, right? So their assumption about how things work is that, if every staff is able to not just be asked to integrate MTV into TNL, but every one of them would be self-motivated, self-initiated, and really, doing what they can to infuse and integrate MTV into teaching and learning. Now, this is what we call an engaged staff. So that's how they see it, in terms of this is the type of stuff that we must have so that we are able to implement the strategies that help us achieve our goal. All right. So this kind of gives you an example of how to write the goals. And so the next part, the next segment, what we're going to do is we are going to go deep into looking at KPIs and how do you write a good KPI. Stay tuned. So for this next segment, what we are going to be looking at is what we call KPIs. Now, one of the most commonly asked question is, how do I write a good KPI? And for the most part, I think that is probably the wrong question to ask. The right question to ask is, what exactly are we measuring? So if you missed the previous segment, please go back and review that, because in that segment itself, I go into helping you understand how do you write a goal. Because once you understand the way that you should be writing a goal and you have that level of clarity, identifying KPIs and determining what kind of KPIs to identify becomes the next logical step. Of course, even with the next logical step itself, you may still want to ask yourself if this is going to be a good KPI. right? So if you have a bunch of candidates for KPI, what you really want to do is you want to ask yourself, you know, which one is a good KPI? And so the criteria for establishing what is a good KPI is fairly simple. I use what I call the valid and reliable criteria to ascertain if a KPI is good. Now, a valid indicator would be any indicator that it's appropriate in measuring the goal or the objectives, right? So, as an example, when we talk about a competent staff, a valid indicator would be um, staff who are effective in classroom teaching. That would be a valid one. But what we want to ask ourselves is, in addition to that, what are other indicators that can help us infer that staff is competent? And so you may think of, a variety of aspects, like, for example, a competent staff is one who is able to engage the students, who have got good relationship with students, who is effective in the classroom, who is able to work well with their peers. Now that is a competent staff, right? And so if your definition is that, then of course the least of all the appropriate indicators that you can think of would be perhaps things like the QSE survey of TSR. That would be an appropriate KPI. You may be looking at staff climate survey, peer relations, for example. That would be another indicator. So those are some of the indicators that are appropriate. But the next question you want to ask yourself is, are they appropriate? They are valid, but are they reliable? Right? And so this is the second part of the criteria that you really want to examine if it is reliable. And when we say reliable, we're saying that, could this indicator itself just be measuring something from one perspective, right? So a typical example is, you may say, well, let's use the evaluation from lesson observation to ascertain if the staff is a competent one. But then some of you might argue that the lesson observation isn't a reliable indicator because it is done only on one lesson out of the many, many, many lessons that the teacher is teaching. And so, would it be fair to simply say that just because of that one lesson itself, we are then putting, a label on the teacher and say that this is competent and this is not competent? And so, this is where the second criterion would help you ascertain if this is a good KPI. So, if it's valid, but it's not reliable. So what you want to do is then you want to see whether you are able to introduce different perspectives, right? I'll go into detail a bit more later on, but first let's look at the validity criteria. So one way I tell my schools is that, when you want to identify indicators for any particular goal, right? What you want to do is you want to ask yourself this question: what is the cause and effect, right? What is the cause and effect? And the cause and effect essentially is, we're looking at, what are the activities and what are the outcomes. So as a school staff developer, you may be looking at some activities like, what are the number of staff or percentage of staff with learning needs in that specific area of focus, right? That could be one part of it. Now, identifying staff with the learning needs is just one part of the equation. The next thing that you need to do is you need to actually equip them with the competencies as well, right? So you need to send them for training. You need to help them equip themselves with all the necessary skill sets in order for them to be bridging the gap in their area of focus, right? So that it's like the activity, it's identifying percentage of staff with that need, and then the outcome, it's what is the percentage of staff now equipped with that need. So what we want to see is we want to see over time a decrease in the activity, right, in the first indicator, and an increase in the second indicator. Now, another example that I could share with you is that let's say you want to start off by introducing innovation in your school, and so one key thing that you can look at is what is the percentage of staff participating in projects that are deemed to be innovative, right? They are deemed to be innovative. So this could be, the activity, like the percentage of staff that are the staff projects that are innovative. Now, then, of course, you have the next part is that looking at that itself may just give you one side of the equation. What you want to do is you also want to look at, you know, what is the percentage of projects in the school that are innovative, and what is the percentage of those projects that are actually helping the school achieve its goals, right? So we all know that, innovation may not result in a certain guarantee outcome, but we definitely would like to see that some of this innovative projects actually contribute to school goals. So that is something that you would want to look at, right? Another example is, what is the percentage of staff who embark on self-led learning, right? What is the percentage of staff who embark on self-led learning? And, at the end of it, what is the ratio of new learning packages that um, came out from staff embarking on self-led learning? So you may have, let's say 100% of staff embarking on self-led learning. So that is just an activity, right? What you want to see is you want to be able to ascertain what is the percentage of them who, out of self-led learning, were able to produce new learning packages. So that may be an outcome that you want to see, right? So this is the validity criterion. And one way to think about it is to use the performance measures builder and start with asking yourself, like, what are the activities pertaining to this goal? What are the outcomes pertaining to this goal? And list them all down, right? Now, once you have listed them down, this will be, all the valid indicators that you can use to measure your goal. Now, that doesn't mean that all these indicators are going to be reliable. And so when we look at the reliability criterion, essentially what we want to look at is we want to look at it from, the different perspective, right? And when we talk about a different perspective, we want to ask ourselves, is this indicator purely just from the staff perspective? Because if it's just from the staff perspective itself, it might tell us just one side of the story. It might not give us the full and complete picture, right? So an example I can give you is, um, you want to know if your staff is confident in using differentiated instruction in the classroom, or using differentiated instruction in home-based learning, right? You want to find out if the staff are confident. So one of the ways that you may do is you may run a survey and ask staff to indicate whether how confident do they feel about implementing or infusing differentiated instruction into HBL. Now, you may get a good number telling you that they are confident and they are ready to go. And for all we know, they may very well be. But we also know that there could be a possibility that some of them might be overestimating themselves, or some of them might even be underestimating themselves. And so some of them might be really not just competent, but they are able to lead others already, right? And but they are not indicating as such. And so, that might result in just one side of the story. So oftentimes we would want to look at um, um, from other perspective itself. So other perspective, that you can look at are, for example, like system perspective, right? Do you provide sufficient learning opportunities for staff? That would be from a system perspective. In other words, are you putting in place learning opportunities, learning program to help staff to be able to meet that goal itself? Those will be from system perspective. At the same time, you also want to look at it from the school perspective, right? Them being able to apply that learning, right? Is it actually helping the school achieve its goal, right? So is there a link there? Now, how do you make that link? You go back to asking yourself, what is the focus of my school? What kind of staff must we have? And what must we do to help our staff become that? Once you have that answer, you have all these different parts in place. You have the system in place, right? Where you provide learning opportunities, and then you equip your staff with the competencies and skills, right? And that by looking at whether they are able to apply that in the classroom. And then, of course, you also want to see whether does that make an impact on the students' outcome. So it may result in a certain development of students' abilities and interests. And finally, collectively, if everybody is able to do that and all students are able to achieve their learning outcomes, that's where you are able to arrive at the school outcome. So this really kind of helps you think about, you know, it's your KPI, both valid as well as reliable. So the thing that I'd like you to consider now is the following: to look at your current set of KPIs and essentially just simply ask yourself, right? Um, do they pass both the valid or reliable criteria, right? Do they pass both the valid and reliable criteria? If at any point in time the answer is no, or you're not sure, that is the time for you to really relook at your KPIs and to determine if your KPIs are valid and reliable, right? Now, we are going to look at some examples in this next segment itself. So I really want you to take some time to look at your own KPIs and see if they are both valid and reliable. See you in the next one. So let's look at some examples of KPIs that are being identified by the schools that I worked with previously. So here the example we're following up from the previous one there. Here the example, it's the school wants a restorative culture. The staff, it's a world-class RP practitioner. And so what are some KPIs they can potentially look at? So they're looking at it from two angle. One is they're looking at it from the staff angle, and the other one is looking at it from the system angle, right? So the system angle essentially is looking at the number of learning opportunities to develop staff in the area of RP. And then from the staff angle, it's, what's the percentage of staff that indicate their confidence in facilitating circle time. Now, this is just some examples yourself, but you get the idea that when you are deciding on the KPIs, you want to ask yourself, can I look at different perspective? Can I look at system? Can I look at staff? Can I look at students? Can I look at school? Right? And all this different perspective will kind of give you an idea of a basket of KPIs that help you measure the outcome in both a valid and reliable way, right? Let's look at another example that we show you earlier on. This school wants to design a differentiated learning experience. And what they want to do is to make sure that every staff is a competent professional who designs differentiated learning experiences. And so, looking at it from a staff perspective, right? They are looking at percentage of staff indicating that designing differentiated learning experiences is an area of learning need, right? And the other aspect is, percentage of them able to design differentiated learning experience from different student segment. So as you can see here, this is some examples of indicators that it's able to show you how you are able to have a basket of indicators that help you measure the attainment of the goal, right? Let's look at another example here. And this example is whereby the school wants to develop self-directed individuals who are creative and critical thinkers, and they have a bunch of objectives. And the staff goal is an engaged staff who is effective in integrating, making thinking visible in teaching and learning. So, what are some indicators that they could look at, right? Some indicators that they can definitely look at would be, what are the percentage of staff who are able to um, bring about, the integrate making thinking visible into that whole mix itself, right? So that is, the KPIs and targets for this segment here. Um, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna skip this part here, and so the next part really is looking at target setting. Now, target setting, as I mentioned during our online segment, is that when you set target, there has to be a basis for setting target. So it's not like, oh, last year it's 90, let's increase that by 2% this year, and 2% every year, right? So that's not quite the way to do it. There has to be a methodological way to set your target. And so there are three kinds of targets or basis for target setting that you can consider. The first one, it's what we call historical targets. So essentially here it's you are looking at past data to extrapolate, what is the target that you may be looking at going forward. So one way of looking at it is that, historical data would kind of tell you that in the past you have been doing this, and then based on past performances you are going to extrapolate going forward, right? So that it's the way to look at historical data. Now, at some point in time, you would also want to look at comparative data. And comparative data essentially just helps you look at, in terms of, you know um, the data or the targets that you have. Are those targets good enough in relation to your competition or to similar schools, for example, right? So that it's the comparative data. And the last one really is looking at benchmark data. And this is where, perhaps you want to benchmark yourself against a certain category of schools, and this is where you would want to perhaps ask yourself if this is what you are able to achieve at, and that's where you have targets that are set at benchmark level, right? So um, this was just some examples for you to consider in terms of the way that you set your KPIs and targets. So make sure you go back and review your KPIs and targets um, for your own plans. And then when we meet again in the clinic session, let's go through some of your examples and let's see how we could better improve your KPIs and your targets there. All right, with that, thank you so much for your time, and I'll see you on the next one.